The room had been chosen for display rather than comfort. A long walnut table stretched beneath soft amber lighting, polished to the point where reflections trembled on its surface like restrained nerves. Crystal glasses stood aligned with military precision, each one catching and refracting the glow of the chandelier overhead in precise, calculated angles. Linen napkins rested untouched, folded into shapes that suggested patience more than hospitality, geometric swans that would never take flight, origami flowers that would never bloom. Outside the tall windows, the city glowed, distant, indifferent, powerful. Manhattan's skyline carved sharp silhouettes against the darkening sky, a monument to ambition made visible. The dining room itself was a masterclass in controlled opulence. Crown molding traced the ceiling's perimeter with aristocratic restraint. Original artwork, a Rothko, two small hoppers, a controversial Basquiat, lined the walls at intervals calculated to impress without overwhelming. The hardwood floors gleamed beneath Persian rugs older than anyone in the room. Every element had been selected not just for beauty, but for message. We have always been here, we will always remain. Amara Vale sat near the far end of the table, hands folded loosely in her lap, posture composed but unassuming. She wore no statement jewelry, no colors meant to command attention. Her dress was simple, charcoal gray, elegant in a way that never demanded applause. A single strand of pearls, her grandmother's, rested against her collarbone, the only adornment she permitted herself. To anyone watching casually, she blended into the room like a supporting detail, present, polite, forgettable. That, she had learned long ago, was useful. She had arrived 30 minutes early, as was her habit, not to claim territory or advantage, but to observe the room before it filled with performance. She had walked the perimeter slowly, checking sight lines, noting where conversations would naturally cluster, where alliances might form in the spaces between courses. Her grandmother had taught her this. Rooms spoke if you listened before the voices arrived. Now, with 16 family members seated around the table and servers gliding between them with practiced invisibility, the performance had begun in earnest. Across from her, laughter broke the tension. It belonged to Marcus Hale. Marcus leaned back in his chair with practiced confidence, one arm draped over the polished wood as if he owned it. His cufflinks, platinum, monogrammed, ostentatious, caught the light every time he gestured, which was often. He spoke loudly, comfortably, like a man accustomed to being heard without resistance. His suit was impeccable, Savile Row tailored to emphasize broad shoulders and minimize the soft beginnings of middle-age expansion. Salt and pepper hair swept back from a face that had learned to project authority through repetition rather than achievement. He was, Amara had long ago concluded, the most dangerous kind of mediocre man, one who had convinced himself that confidence and competence were the same thing. And of course, Marcus said, lifting his glass of Chateau Margaux slightly, swirling it with the exaggerated care of someone who had taken exactly one wine course and never forgotten it, some people here are still figuring out what they bring to the table. A few guests smiled reflexively, others shifted uncomfortably. Elena Vale, Amara's aunt, stiffened almost imperceptibly, her fingers tightening around her fork. Cousin Daniel stared down at his duck confit as though it held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. Uncle Richard cleared his throat but said nothing. The younger generation, 3 cousins in their 20s, exchanged glances that communicated everything and nothing. Amara felt the words before she registered the sound of them. Not because they were sharp, they weren't, but because they were aimed. She had developed, over years of similar dinners, a kind of radar for veiled attacks. The shift in air pressure when someone prepared to diminish you. The collective held breath of witnesses who knew something unpleasant was coming, but would do nothing to prevent it. She raised her eyes slowly, meeting Marcus's gaze with the calm neutrality of someone examining an interesting, but ultimately inconsequential painting. Marcus met her look with a faint, knowing smile, the kind that suggested amusement at someone else's expense, carefully disguised as charm. His eyes held a glitter that might have been wine or might have been malice. I mean, he continued, setting his glass down with deliberate care, this is a family dinner, right? We should all be honest about our contributions. Some of us carry the weight. Some of us, he paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to sharpen the blade, benefit from proximity. A soft chuckle rippled down one side of the table, nervous, complicit laughter from those who recognized cruelty but lacked the courage to challenge it. Amara did not move, she did not flinch, she did not respond. Inside, something old and familiar tightened, an echo of boardrooms where her presence had been underestimated, of meetings where silence had been mistaken for ignorance, of 1,000 small humiliations that men like Marcus distributed like business cards, never quite crossing the line into actionable offense, always maintaining plausible deniability. She had learned not to rush these moments. Power, when revealed too quickly, lost its edge. Restraint, her grandmother had insisted, was not the absence of strength but its most refined form. Her grandmother's voice surfaced in her mind, calm and unwavering. Let them finish speaking. People reveal more than they intend when they believe you are beneath them. Victoria Vale had been dead for 3 years now, but her lessons remained more present than most living advisors. She had built the family empire from the wreckage of her husband's gambling addiction and her father's bankruptcy, transforming a near-worthless textile company into a diversified holdings group worth $8 billion. She had done it without ever raising her voice, without ever demanding credit. And she had chosen Amara, not her louder, more conventionally ambitious siblings and cousins, as her true successor. Marcus tilted his head slightly, eyes still on Amara, savoring the moment like a predator that had cornered something it mistook for prey. No offense, of course, he added, though the words lacked any effort to soften the blow. His tone carried the familiar cadence of powerful men who said no offense to grant themselves permission to offend with impunity. Not everyone needs ambition. Some people are comfortable where they are. The implication hung in the air like smoke. You are decorative, you are expendable, you are here because of blood, not merit. Across the table, Elena Vale's knuckles had gone white against the silver fork handle. A cousin, Rebecca, youngest daughter of Uncle Richard, glanced at Amara with something that might have been sympathy or might have been relief that she wasn't the target. No one intervened. Silence settled, thick and expectant. The servers, trained to recognize tension, had paused their rounds. The room held its collective breath, waiting for humiliation to complete its arc. Amara finally reached for her water, lifting the baccarat crystal glass with steady grace. She took a slow sip, buying herself time, not because she needed it, but because restraint had always been her strongest advantage. The water was ice cold, infused with cucumber and mint. She let it cool the heat building in her chest. Marcus watched her, clearly enjoying the moment. He mistook her composure for submission, her silence for defeat. "What do you think?" he pressed lightly, leaning forward now, sensing what he believed was weakness. "You've been awfully quiet tonight." The question landed like a challenge, like an invitation to respond emotionally, to defend herself, to prove she belonged at this table through some display of verbal sparring that would only confirm his narrative about her. She had watched men like Marcus her entire life. They craved reaction. They fed on it. Anger validated them. Tears energized them. Even articulate defense gave them the confrontation they desired, the proof that they had gotten under your skin. Amara set the glass down, aligning it carefully with the edge of her Limoges plate. Her movements were precise, unhurried. She straightened her spine, feeling the pearls shift against her skin, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, even warm, the tone of someone making polite conversation rather than parrying an attack. "I think," she said, "that dinners are more interesting when people feel free to speak honestly." Marcus smiled wider, misreading her response as acquiescence. "Exactly." A few heads turned between them, sensing something shift beneath the surface, though unable to identify what. The air felt tighter now, as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something it couldn't quite name. Amara's gaze drifted briefly around the table, faces she knew intimately, histories she carried like inherited jewelry. Elena, who had nearly destroyed the European division through carelessness before Amara had quietly restructured it. Daniel, whose gambling problem she had managed discreetly for 2 years. Uncle Richard, whose affair with his assistant she had kept from becoming public scandal. The younger cousins, who had benefited from trust funds she had personally insured, remained solvent during the 2008 crash. Generations sat there, bound by blood, contracts, and secrets older than the city outside those windows. Most of them had no idea how many threads she held, how much weight she carried while appearing to carry none. She returned her attention to Marcus, her expression pleasant, almost curious. "And I think," she continued, her voice carrying just enough to reach the entire table without rising in volume, "that honesty often says more about the speaker than the listener." The words landed softly, but their impact rippled outward like a stone dropped into still water. A subtle pause followed, just long enough for the meaning to settle, for people to hear the careful precision of her response, to recognize that she had neither defended herself nor attacked him, only observed, accurately, what he had revealed about himself. Marcus laughed, but it came a fraction of a second too late, carried a note slightly too sharp. "Touché, didn't know you had it in you." He tried to make it sound admiring, collegial even, but something in the room had shifted. Several people were looking at Amara differently now, not with pity or sympathy, but with a kind of reassessment, as if seeing for the first time something that had always been there. Amara offered a small, polite smile, not defensive, not offended, simply observant, the smile of someone who had made her point and required nothing further. She took another sip of water, then turned to her left, engaging Alina in conversation about the Foundation's upcoming gala, as if Marcus had ceased to exist. Dinner resumed, conversation splintering into safer topics, market rumors, travel plans, surface-level anecdotes meant to patch over discomfort. The duck gave way to a palate cleanser of champagne sorbet. The sorbet made way for a dessert of pear tart with vanilla bean ice cream. Espresso arrived in delicate cups. The rhythm of a formal dinner reasserted itself. Yet something had changed. Beneath the clink of silverware and low laughter, tension hummed quietly, a frequency only some could hear. Marcus leaned toward the man beside him, James Hale, his younger brother and chief enabler, and whispered something, glancing at Amara again as he did. His expression held no concern. If anything, it carried satisfaction, the look of a man who believed he had landed a blow and gotten away with it. He had no idea. Not about the document signed under Amara's direction that morning, finalizing the transfer of voting rights from 3 separate trust entities. Not about the ownership structure quietly rebalanced over the past 18 months, moving controlling interest through a series of legal mechanisms so subtle that even the family's attorneys had barely noticed. Not about the way true power flowed within the empire, silent, strategic, absolute. Not about the fact that while he had been speaking, she had been calculating. While he had been performing, she had been preparing. Amara listened as plates were cleared with the whisper-soft efficiency of well-trained staff, as dessert was served on porcelain so thin it was nearly translucent, as conversation lulled and rose again like tide against shore. She played her role perfectly, responding when spoken to with warmth and attention, offering nothing more than courtesy but never less. But inside, her thoughts were already moving ahead, calculating, remembering, aligning pieces that had been set in motion long before this dinner had been planned. Marcus believed power announced itself loudly, that authority required performance, that control demanded visibility. She knew better. Her grandmother had known better. And so Amara sat through coffee, through the slow dispersal of family members calling for cars and making their goodbyes, through the careful social choreography of a gathering ending without disaster, but also without warmth. As the evening stretched on and the city lights deepened beyond the windows, transforming the skyline into a constellation of ambition and industry, Amara wondered, not for the first time, how many people watching her right now assumed they understood her place at this table. And she wondered, quietly, with the first stirrings of something that might have been anticipation or might have been satisfaction, how they would react when the truth finally made itself impossible to ignore. Marcus was the last to leave, naturally. He paused by the door, turning back to survey the room with the proprietary air of someone who believed he owned not just the space but the legacy it represented. His eyes found Amara one final time. "Good dinner," he said, as if hosting rather than attending. "It was," Amara agreed neutrally. He nodded, satisfied, and stepped into the night. Amara remained for a moment longer, standing beside the table where generations of her family had gathered, fought, reconciled, and competed. She ran her fingers along the polished wood, feeling the grain beneath the finish, the solid reality of something built to last. Then she turned off the lights and walked away, her heels clicking softly against hardwood, leaving the room in darkness. Behind her, pieces she had set in motion months ago continued their inexorable movement toward conclusion. If you were sitting at that table, would you have spoken up, or waited, like Amara, for the right moment to let silence do the work? Part 2, the morning after. The morning after the dinner arrived without ceremony. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Amara Vale's penthouse office, diffused by sheer curtains that softened the city into pale silhouettes. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of traffic far below, the urban symphony of delivery trucks and early commuters, and the steady ticking of a clock mounted discreetly behind a framed abstract painting. The Kandinsky, one of her grandmother's favorites, held more meaning than most visitors realized. Its chaotic surface disguised careful structure, color deployed with mathematical precision. The space reflected Amara precisely, orderly, restrained, intentional. No excess, no noise. The desk was mid-century walnut, clean-lined and functional. 2 chairs faced it, comfortable but not luxurious. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on economics, history and philosophy, interspersed with family photo albums and first editions that had belonged to her grandmother. A single orchid bloomed on the credenza, white petals against dark wood. Amara stood near the window, a porcelain cup warming her palms. The coffee was dark roast, Kenyan, prepared exactly how she liked it, strong enough to taste like commitment. She had been awake for hours, not because of Marcus Hale, but because moments like the one he had created tended to ripple outward. Humiliation, especially public and unchallenged, rarely remained isolated. It invited repetition. It established precedent. She didn't intend to let that happen. Her phone had been busy since 5 a.m. 3 messages from Alina, increasingly agitated. 2 from Daniel, carefully worded to avoid taking sides while clearly seeking guidance. 1 from Rebecca asking if she was okay, with enough sincerity to be touching and enough naivety to be concerning. She had responded to none of them yet. Timing mattered. Behind her, the door opened softly. No knock. He knew better than to interrupt her morning routine with unnecessary formality. "Good morning," Elias Rowan said. Amara didn't turn right away. She recognized his footsteps, the measured cadence of someone who never hurried unless it mattered. "You're early." "You were on my calendar before sunrise," Elias replied mildly. "That usually means something interesting happened." She allowed herself a small smile and finally turned. Elias stood near the desk, impeccably dressed as always, dark suit in charcoal wool, crisp white shirt, burgundy tie with a subtle pattern that suggested thought without ostentation. His silver hair was precisely cut, his posture that of a man who had spent decades in rooms where appearance communicated capability. At 62, he moved with the efficiency of someone who had eliminated all unnecessary motion from his life. He wasn't family by blood, but he was as close to indispensable as anyone could be. For 12 years he had been her strategist, her shield, and in moments no one else ever saw, her mirror, the person who reflected back to her not what she wanted to hear, but what she needed to understand. They had met at her grandmother's funeral. He had been Victoria's attorney for 30 years, the architect of countless legal structures that had protected and grown the family fortune. In the receiving line, he had shaken Amara's hand and said simply, "She spoke of you often. She believed you understood that power is architecture, not performance." 6 weeks later, she had hired him away from his firm with an offer that was generous but not extravagant. What she had really offered was purpose, the chance to continue Victoria's work with someone who shared her philosophy. "Did you watch the dinner feed?" she asked now, returning to the present. The family dining room had cameras, ostensibly for security but practically for record keeping. Attendance, conversation, alliances, all documented, all reviewable. Most family members forgot they existed. Amara never did. "I did," Elias said, crossing to the small coffee service Amara kept near the window. He poured himself a cup with the comfortable familiarity of ritual. "Twice. And Marcus Hale continues to mistake volume for authority." He took a sip, considered. "Though I'll admit, his timing was better than usual. He waited until the duck course, calculated to maximize audience while minimizing escape routes." Amara nodded, unsurprised. Marcus wasn't clever, but he was occasionally strategic. He'll push harder now. "Yes," Elias agreed, moving to one of the chairs and settling into it with a slight sigh. His knee had been bothering him lately, though he never mentioned it. Men like him always do when they think they've found a weak point. They're like sharks with blood in the water, incapable of restraint. Amara crossed the room and sat behind her desk, the morning light framing her from behind, putting her face in slight shadow. Another lesson from her grandmother: let people work to see you clearly. It made them pay attention. "Do you think the others noticed?" she asked. Elias considered that, setting his cup on the small side table. Some did. Alina certainly did. Her blood pressure probably spiked enough to be medically concerning. Your cousin Daniel did too, though he doesn't yet know what he noticed. He's still processing the dissonance between what he expected you to do and what you actually did. And Marcus? He noticed only what he wanted to. Elias met her eyes directly, which is the most dangerous kind of observation. He's convinced himself he won something last night. That answer lingered between them, heavy with implication. Amara moved behind her desk, unlocking the bottom drawer and removing a thin folder. Inside were reports, ownership summaries, voting structures, trust arrangements that spanned decades. Most people assumed the Vale family empire operated on tradition and visible hierarchy. They believed the eldest spoke for the group. They believed titles reflected control. They believed the organizational charts distributed to shareholders represented reality. They were wrong. The true architecture of power in the Vale Empire was invisible to anyone who hadn't spent years studying it. Victoria had designed it that way deliberately, creating layers of trusts, holding companies, and voting agreements that functioned like a system of locks. Only someone with all the keys could open them. Only someone patient enough to acquire those keys one at a time could ever consolidate control. Amara had been acquiring keys since she was 23. Marcus has been circling the board for months, Elias continued, watching her face as she reviewed the documents. Last night gave him confidence. He'll accelerate whatever plans he's been nurturing. Let him, Amara said quietly, running her finger down a column of numbers that represented voting shares held in trust by entities most people had forgotten existed. Confidence makes people careless. It also makes them dangerous. So does competence, Amara countered. I'd rather face a confident fool than a cautious one. Elias watched her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. There was something in his eyes that might have been concern or might have been curiosity. Are you ready for what comes with revealing yourself? Amara paused, her finger stopping mid-column. It was the question beneath every strategic decision she had ever made. Power, once exposed, could not be unseen. It changed relationships fundamentally and irrevocably. It reframed memories. It transformed casual conversations into political calculations. It turned family dinners into performances and holidays into negotiations. It demanded confrontation. Her grandmother had borne that weight for 40 years. The isolation of being the one person who truly understood where power resided and how it functioned. The loneliness of making decisions no one else could make, taking responsibility no one else would take. Amara had watched it wear Victoria down, year by year, until all that remained was clarity and will. I've been ready for years, she said finally, closing the folder. I just needed the right moment, the right catalyst. She met Elias' eyes directly. Marcus gave me that. He has no idea, does he? None whatsoever. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. He thinks he humiliated me. He thinks he established dominance. He thinks the others will remember last night as proof of his strength and my weakness. When actually, Amara said, he showed everyone who would listen that he uses cruelty as strategy, that he needs to diminish others to feel powerful, that his authority is performative rather than structural. She stood, walking back to the window, coffee cup cradled in both hands. Below, the city was waking up fully now, streams of people heading to work, to meetings, to the endless circulation of commerce and ambition. Prepare the groundwork, she added, her voice quieter now. But not yet. I want him comfortable. I want him confident enough to overreach. Elias inclined his head. As you wish. He stood, preparing to leave, then paused. Amara. Yes. If you were watching that dinner, he asked carefully, as an outside observer with no stakes in the outcome, what would you have thought of the woman sitting at that table? He didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice carried a weight that suggested he'd been considering the questions seriously. I would have thought she was choosing patience over pride, he said finally, and I would have wondered how many people mistake those two for the same thing, when actually they're opposites. Pride demands immediate response. Patience demands the discipline to wait for the right response. He moved toward the door, then turned back one more time. Your grandmother would have been proud, you know, not of what you're planning to do, though she would approve of that too, but of what you didn't do last night. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Amara alone again with her thoughts and the city and the careful architecture of power she had been building stone by invisible stone for nearly a decade. Her thoughts drifted, unbidden, to another dinner years ago, smaller, quieter, and infinitely more dangerous. She had been 26, newly returned from 3 years at Oxford, where she'd studied economics and philosophy, and watched how old money in England maintained itself through institutions and discretion. She had come back to New York with a doctorate, a network of international contacts, and a quiet determination to understand how the family business actually worked. Her grandmother had been dying then, though few knew it yet. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, given 6 months at diagnosis and already 4 months in. Victoria had kept it secret from everyone except Amara and her doctor, unwilling to invite the circling that comes when succession looms. That night, in a private dining room much smaller than the one where Marcus had performed his cruelty, the board of directors had gathered. 12 men, all over 60, all convinced that their decades of service entitled them to choose the next leader. They had been discussing, quite openly, how to restructure the voting agreements to prevent inexperienced family members from making emotional decisions about the company's direction. It had been, ostensibly, about protecting the legacy. Actually, it had been about protecting their positions, their salaries, their sense of importance. Amara had sat quietly through 3 hours of discussion, asking occasional questions, taking notes, offering no opinions. They had smiled at her indulgently when she spoke, praised her intelligence while dismissing her insights, and generally treated her like a bright child who would eventually understand that serious business was not for her. She had said very little then, too. By the end of that year, she controlled the voting trusts of 5 subsidiaries and held irrevocable authority over the family's core assets through a series of legal maneuvers so elegant that most of the board members never fully understood what had happened. The agreements they thought protected their power had actually consolidated hers. 3 of them had resigned, 4 had stayed on at reduced authority, 5 had never quite figured out what changed. Her grandmother had watched it all from her hospital bed, growing weaker, but somehow seeming more satisfied each day. A week before she died, Victoria had taken Amara's hand with fingers that felt like paper and bones. Power, she had whispered, her voice already fading, is not about making people respect you. It's about making them realize they should have respected you all along. Memory faded, replaced by resolve. Downstairs, 23 floors below, the city moved forward unaware. Somewhere across town, Marcus Hale was likely replaying the dinner in his head, savoring what he believed was dominance, planning his next move with the confidence of someone who fundamentally misunderstood the game being played. Amara wondered how long it would take before that certainty fractured. And if you were watching all of this unfold, would you recognize restraint as strength, or would you, like Marcus, mistake silence for surrender? Part 3: Marcus Ascendant. Marcus Hale woke with satisfaction. The morning light cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his condominium in the Woolworth building, glinting off chrome fixtures and minimalist art chosen less for meaning than for impression. His decorator had called the aesthetic contemporary power: clean lines, expensive materials, nothing that suggested comfort or warmth. Everything in the space was positioned to communicate success. The original Warhol print, the custom Italian furniture, the view that cost $30,000 a month in rent. He stretched in bed, Egyptian cotton sheets sliding against skin, and checked his phone before his feet touched the heated marble floor. The device was already full of notifications, the digital pulse of importance. 3 missed calls, 2 messages, a dozen emails marked urgent. All from family members who hadn't spoken up at dinner. He smiled. This was how power worked. You made a move, you established dominance. Then people came to you privately, quietly, seeking reassurance or alignment or protection. They gravitated towards strength even when they disapproved of how it was displayed. He listened to the first voicemail as he walked naked across the bedroom to the espresso machine that occupied an entire counter in his kitchen. Another symbol of refined taste he'd acquired wholesale from a lifestyle magazine article. Marcus, about last night, Elena's voice began, hesitant and uncomfortable. Perhaps we should talk. I think there might be some misunderstanding about where we all stand. Would you have time this week? It's important. He deleted it without responding. Elena had always been weak, too concerned with feelings and fairness to understand how business actually worked. She would fall in line eventually or become irrelevant. Either outcome was acceptable. The second message came from Daniel, short, deferential, asking if they could meet later in the week to discuss the family's strategic direction. Marcus considered it while the espresso machine hissed and steamed, then typed a brief reply: "Tomorrow, my office, 10 a.m. No pleasantries, no flexibility. The message itself was a power play. I'll see you on my schedule in my territory at my convenience. He didn't bother with the third call. Probably Rebecca whining about civility, or whatever idealistic nonsense the younger generation confused with leadership. As he dressed, another custom suit, this one navy with a subtle pinstripe, paired with a tie that cost more than most people's monthly grocery bills, Marcus replayed the moment he'd addressed Amara across the table, the way she'd held herself, calm, controlled, too controlled. That kind of composure, he believed, usually hid insecurity. The truly confident didn't need to regulate themselves so carefully. They let their power show naturally, effortlessly. She had coasted on the family name for years. No visible ambition, no hunger, no publications or public speaking or board positions that would mark her as a serious player. He'd seen it countless times in family businesses, relatives content to exist on dividends rather than vision, happy to attend meetings and collect checks without doing the actual work of leadership. And yet, her response had been sharper than he'd expected, not defiant but precise, measured. That comment about honesty revealing more about the speaker than the listener, it had been clever, too clever for someone he'd dismissed as decorative. Marcus paused while knotting his tie, studying himself in the full-length mirror that dominated his dressing room. No, he was overthinking it, reading complexity into simplicity. She'd managed one good line, probably rehearsed, possibly plagiarized from some book about female empowerment. It didn't mean anything. He dismissed the thought as he adjusted his cufflinks. Platinum, custom-made with his family crest, a symbol he'd commissioned himself since the Hale family didn't actually have one. By noon he was in his office overlooking the Hudson River, holding court. His office was everything his home aspired to be, imposing, expensive, strategically designed to make visitors feel small. The desk was massive, black lacquer, positioned so that anyone sitting across from him had to look up slightly. The chairs for visitors were beautiful but uncomfortable. The art was bolder, more aggressive. A Liechtenstein screamed in primary colors. A Kuhn sculpture caught light like a weapon. Advisors rotated throughout the morning, offering updates and forecasts, all reinforcing what he already believed. The family empire needed modern leadership, aggressive leadership, someone willing to make hard decisions, cut dead weight, push into new markets without being paralyzed by tradition or sentiment. And he was the only one willing to take it. Board support is fragmented, one consultant said cautiously, a nervous man named Patterson who specialized in corporate governance and had questionable political instincts. You don't yet have a majority for any major restructuring. Not officially, Marcus replied, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of someone who believed momentum was destiny. But momentum isn't measured on paper alone, it's measured in perception, in trajectory. What about Amara Vale? Another asked, this one a woman named Chen who Marcus had hired specifically because she asked annoying questions that sometimes proved useful. She hasn't stated a position on governance reform, neither support nor opposition. Marcus waved a hand dismissively, the gesture of someone swatting away a fly. She doesn't have one. Amara doesn't think strategically, she thinks decoratively. The room nodded along, though Chen's expression suggested skepticism. She was too politic to voice. Momentum felt tangible now. He could sense it in how quickly people returned his calls, in how meetings ran on his schedule, in the subtle deference he received at family events. Power had gravity. Once you had enough of it, it pulled more toward you automatically. Still, later that afternoon, when he caught his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, a flicker of unease crossed his mind. Amara's eyes at dinner, steady, unreadable, patient, hadn't looked like defeat. They'd looked like waiting. He shook it off. Probably just good breeding. Old families taught their daughters to maintain composure, even when humiliated. It was practically in their DNA. By evening, the thought was gone, replaced by satisfaction as he reviewed preliminary plans for restructuring the family holdings. More aggressive investment strategies, high-risk acquisitions, the kind of bold moves that would either generate enormous returns or spectacular failures, but either way would make him visible, important, the subject of business school case studies. Legacy, he had decided long ago, required spectacle. Part 4. The first shift. The first shift happened subtly. It began with a call Marcus expected to go well. 3 days after the dinner, he was in his office reviewing acquisition targets when his assistant buzzed him. Gerald Thompson on line 1. Thompson, chair of the family's primary holding board, a man Marcus had dined with twice in the past month, carefully cultivating, strategically flattering. Thompson was 72, conservative in temperament. Skeptical of change but hungry for relevance. Marcus had convinced himself he had Thompson's support, or at least his neutrality. He picked up the phone with confidence. "Gerald, good to hear from you." Marcus, the older man's voice sounded strained, like someone about to deliver bad news they didn't want to deliver. "I wanted to give you a heads up before it becomes public. There's been a development." Marcus leaned back in his chair, still confident. Developments could be managed. Go on. There was a vote this afternoon, an emergency session. Thompson paused, a restructuring of the voting trust arrangements. Marcus frowned. Emergency votes required notice, proper channels. A vote requires 48 hours minimum notification to all board members. I received no such notice. Yes, it did. Everything was done by the book. Thompson sounded almost apologetic. The notice went out 72 hours ago, actually, Monday morning. Monday, 3 days before the dinner. Marcus's mind raced backward. He'd received something Monday, had barely glanced at it. Legal documents he'd assumed were routine, boilerplate, the kind of administrative paperwork that circulated constantly in a complex family holding structure. What was the outcome? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. A pause, longer this time, the kind of pause that preceded disaster. The controlling interest has been consolidated. Marcus straightened in his chair, spine rigid. By whom? Another pause, weighted with significance. Thompson clearly understood, even if Marcus didn't yet. Amara Vale. The words landed without sound, but Marcus felt them all the same. Like a punch to the solar plexus delivered so precisely, it left no external mark. That's not possible, he said flatly, his voice hardening. She doesn't hold the majority. I've reviewed the ownership structures. She has, at most, 11% of the voting shares, meaningful but hardly controlling. She does now. Thompson's voice carried a strange mixture of respect and resignation. She's consolidated voting authority over 95% of the operational empire. The number made no sense. 95% was impossible. That would require... Marcus's mind raced through the mathematics. That would require control over not just individual shares but entire voting trusts. The Carter Trust, the Victoria Memorial Foundation, the overseas holding companies in Delaware and the Caymans, the subsidiaries that had operated independently for decades. How? The word came out sharper than intended. The mechanisms were already in place, Thompson said, have been for years, apparently. Layered voting agreements triggered by consolidation events. She simply activated them. Consolidation events? What consolidation events? Marcus, Thompson's voice carried a gentle pity that was somehow worse than anger. I think perhaps you should speak with your legal team, or with Elias Rowan. I'm not the person who can explain the full architecture. Architecture, the word hung in the air. This is a power play, Marcus said, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice and hatting it. An aggressive move designed to. It's a structure, Thompson interrupted, his voice firmer now, one that's been in place for some time. We were simply operating under assumptions that turned out to be incorrect. We? Yes, we, the board, the family, most of us anyway. Thompson exhaled audibly. She's been controlling things for years, Marcus. We just didn't realize it. The call ended without ceremony. Thompson had other calls to make, other board members to notify. Marcus sat in his office, phone still in hand, staring at nothing. The city beyond his windows continued its indifferent movement. Traffic flowed. Boats carved white lines across the river. Somewhere, people were conducting normal business, making normal decisions, living in a world where the ground beneath them wasn't suddenly, inexplicably, transformed into quicksand. For the first time in years, certainty abandoned him. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Elias Rowan. Marcus hesitated, his finger hovering over the answer button. Part of him wanted to decline the call, to buy himself time to think, to process, to understand what had just happened. But declining would look like weakness. Worse, it would look like fear. He answered. Marcus, Elias said pleasantly, warmly, with the tone of someone delivering good news rather than coordinating a coup. I thought it best you heard from me directly. Marcus said nothing, unwilling to give Elias the satisfaction of hearing confusion or anger in his voice. There will be a formal announcement tomorrow morning, Elias continued, smooth and professional, but in the interest of transparency, Amara now holds controlling authority over 95% of the family's operational empire. The voting structures have been consolidated under mechanisms that were established some time ago. Blindsided, Marcus said finally, the word emerging cold and sharp. You blindsided the board. No, Elias corrected, his voice patient. You overlooked the quiet votes. There's a difference. Everything was properly noticed. Everything was conducted according to the existing agreements. We didn't change the rules, Marcus. We simply understood them better than you did. The we in that sentence landed like an accusation. This won't stand, Marcus said, though even as he spoke he could hear how empty the words sounded. There are legal challenges, governance requirements, family agreements that support exactly what happened, Elias finished. I'd encourage you to review them carefully, with competent counsel. You'll find everything was done not just legally, but in accordance with structures your own grandfather helped design. That detail struck Marcus like a slap. His grandfather, Robert Hale, had been one of Victoria Vale's early partners, one of the men who had built the empire alongside her. Had he known, had he built these mechanisms deliberately, knowing that someday power would consolidate exactly this way? Why, Marcus asked, hearing the defeat creeping into his own voice, why reveal this now? Elias paused before answering, as if considering how much honesty to offer. Because, he said finally, you made it necessary. You mistook Amara's restraint for weakness. You confused her patience with incompetence, and you were careless enough to demonstrate that confusion publicly. The reference to the dinner was unmistakable. So this is revenge. Marcus tried to make it sound dismissive. It came out desperate. No, Elias said, his voice hardening slightly. This is correction. You were operating under false assumptions. Now you're operating under accurate ones. The call ended. Marcus stared at the dark screen of his phone, seeing his own reflection distorted in the glass. Around him, his carefully constructed office felt suddenly different. The expensive art looked like compensation. The imposing desk looked like performance. The view looked like set dressing. None of it was real power. None of it had ever been. He had been playing a game on a board he didn't understand, following rules that didn't exist, winning victories that had never mattered. And Amara Vale had been playing an entirely different game, one she'd already won years ago. The realization settled over him like ice water. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus Hale understood what it felt like to be truly, completely, irrevocably outmaneuvered. And the worst part, the part that would haunt him in the hours and days to come, was that he still didn't fully understand how it had happened. Only that it had. Only that while he'd been making noise, she'd been building architecture. While he'd been performing power, she'd been exercising it. Part 5, Public and Private. The announcement came the next morning at precisely 9 a.m. The press conference had been organized with remarkable speed, or rather, Amara reflected as she reviewed her notes one final time. It had been organized weeks ago and simply awaited activation. Elias had arranged everything: the room at the Mandarin Oriental, the media list, the carefully calibrated invitation strategy that ensured the right balance of financial press, family office publications, and general business media. Markets reacted within minutes of the news hitting the wire. Vale Holdings stock jumped 8% in the first hour of trading. Analysts scrambled to revise their models, their previous assessments rendered instantly obsolete by information they should have had all along, but had never bothered to investigate. Family members flooded their inboxes with questions they should have asked years earlier, their messages ranging from congratulatory to confused to barely concealed hostile. Amara stood at the podium, composed as ever, as cameras clicked and murmurs rippled through the assembled media. She wore navy, authoritative without being aggressive, and the pearls, always the pearls. Her grandmother's pearls, which carried more weight than any corporate insignia ever could. The room was full but not packed, perhaps 70 people, journalists in the front rows, analysts in the middle, a few family members scattered in the back. She could see Marcus near the rear exit, his expression carefully neutral, jaw tight enough to suggest significant dental bills in his future. She spoke without notes, without flourish, without triumph. Good morning, thank you for being here. I'll keep my remarks brief, as I know many of you have questions, and I'd prefer we spend our time on those rather than extended preamble. A few appreciative nods from the journalists. They were used to executives who loved the sound of their own voices. This morning, we're announcing a consolidation of voting authority within the Vale family holdings. This is not a takeover, she said evenly, letting the words settle before continuing. It is continuity. It is clarification. It is the formalization of structures that have existed for some time but have not been widely understood. She paused, letting that sink in. I've always believed leadership is most effective when it doesn't announce itself prematurely, she continued, her voice carrying clearly through the room without amplification. My role has been to protect what we've built, to honor my grandmother's legacy, and to ensure our enterprise is resilient enough not just to survive but to grow. Her eyes swept the room, pausing briefly on Marcus, who stood near the back, expression still carefully neutral but posture rigid with tension. This consolidation doesn't change our strategic direction. It doesn't alter our commitments to partners, employees, or the communities where we operate. What it does is provide clarity. Decisions will be made more efficiently. Accountability will be clearer. The ambiguity that sometimes paralyzed our progress will be reduced. She let that sit for a moment, then opened for questions. Hands shot up immediately. Ms. Vale, Jonathan Chen, Wall Street Journal. Can you explain the mechanism by which this consolidation occurred? The filing suggests voting trusts and interlocking agreements spanning multiple jurisdictions. Amara smiled slightly. I can, though I suspect the full legal architecture would put everyone to sleep. The simplified version is that my grandmother designed our ownership structure to consolidate authority during periods of potential instability or fragmentation. Those mechanisms have always existed. They simply weren't activated until recently. What triggered the activation? The mechanisms themselves were triggered. Specific conditions were met. Those conditions have to do with voting patterns and ownership transfers occurring over the past 18 months. Translation for anyone paying attention. Marcus's maneuvering had inadvertently triggered the very protections designed to prevent someone like him from gaining control. Another hand, Sarah Williams, Financial Times. There are reports of significant opposition within the family board. How do you respond to concerns that this consolidation was done without adequate consultation? I'd respond by noting that all legal requirements for notice and consultation were exceeded, not merely met. The perception of inadequate consultation stems from some family members not reading documents they were sent or attending meetings for which they were invited. I can't force people to pay attention to governance. I can only ensure the process is properly conducted. A subtle rebuke delivered with perfect politeness. The questions continued for 30 minutes, some hostile, most neutral, a few genuinely curious. Amara answered each one with the same measured precision, informative without being defensive, clear without being condescending. Finally, she raised a hand. I'll take one more question. A hand in the back, younger journalist, probably mid-20s, from a digital publication. Ms. Vale, you've operated largely outside public view for most of your career, despite your family's prominence. Why reveal yourself now? Why not continue operating, as you put it, without premature announcement? It was a better question than most. Amara considered it genuinely. Because, she said finally, there comes a point where opacity becomes its own liability, where the protection that privacy offers is outweighed by the confusion it creates. We've reached that point. Better to operate openly now than risk destabilization later. She didn't add, because Marcus Hale made it necessary, because his public humiliation required public response, because sometimes silence needs to be broken by clarity. But everyone in the room who mattered understood it anyway. The statement ended there. No gloating, no personal remarks about rivals or opponents, no triumph. That restraint unsettled Marcus more than any confrontation could have. Afterward, as people crowded around her with congratulations and questions and business cards offering strategic advice she didn't need, Amara excused herself quietly and stepped into a private corridor. Elias followed, as he always did. He's rattled, Elias said without preamble once they were alone, but not broken. Amara nodded, unsurprised. He won't go quietly. No, Elias agreed, and he'll look for leverage. He's already making calls from what I'm hearing, trying to find legal challenges, governance violations, family members willing to make noise. Let him, Amara's voice was calm. He exposed himself at that dinner. People remember how power is used. They'll remember his cruelty before they remember his arguments. They walked together in silence for a moment, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Through tall windows, the city sprawled below them, indifferent, enormous, alive with its own concerns. Do you regret it? Elias asked quietly. Regret what? Letting him humiliate you first, before revealing this. Amara considered that carefully. It was a question she'd asked herself repeatedly over the past days. No, she said finally. He showed everyone who he is before they saw who I am. That matters. If I'd revealed the power structure first, then responded to his attack, it would have looked defensive, retaliatory. This way his behavior stands independent of my revelation. People can judge each separately. And they'll judge him more harshly for attacking someone they now understand he should have been more careful about. Yes. They stopped at a window overlooking the southern tip of Manhattan. The same city that had watched her underestimated, overlooked, dismissed for years, now watched her rise without spectacle, without violence, without the pyrotechnics that usually accompanied power transitions. What happens now? Elias asked. Now, Amara said, we see how he responds, whether he accepts reality or fights it, whether he chooses dignity or desperation. And if he chooses desperation, then he'll hurt himself more than he could ever hurt me. Elias studied her profile. You're not afraid. It wasn't quite a question. No, Amara said, I'm disappointed. That surprised him. In what? That he mistook humiliation for strategy, she said softly. That's not strength. It's insecurity wearing a strength costume. Real power doesn't need to diminish others to exist. It just exists. Outside, thunder rolled low across the sky. Spring storms moving in from the Atlantic, bringing rain that would clean the streets and remind everyone that nature cared nothing for their human dramas. Somewhere behind them, Marcus Hale was recalibrating, plotting, refusing to accept a reality that had become irrevocable the moment he sent that cruel comment across a dinner table. The real conflict was only beginning. And as this story unfolds, ask yourself, when power shifts hands, is it louder when it's taken or when it's revealed? Part 6: The Backlash. The backlash did not come loudly. It came sideways, like smoke seeping under a door. In the days following the announcement, Marcus Hale did not issue public statements or storm into boardrooms with demands. He smiled in meetings with the tight smile of someone forcing muscles to do something they didn't want to do. He congratulated Amara with measured politeness when their paths crossed at a subsidiary board meeting. He told anyone who would listen that consolidation was interesting and that he respected the process, even as his eyes communicated something else entirely. Privately, he worked carefully, methodically, with the focused intensity of someone who believed, still believed, despite all evidence, that this could be reversed, that Amara's control was somehow illusory or temporary or vulnerable to the right pressure applied in the right places. Amara felt the pressure first through absence. Calls that were usually returned within minutes stretched into hours, then days. Advisors she'd worked with for years suddenly had scheduling conflicts when she requested meetings. A supplier quietly requested to renegotiate terms that had been stable for years, citing market conditions that hadn't actually changed. A partnership deal that had been 90% complete stalled inexplicably, the other party's enthusiasm cooling without explanation. None of it was dramatic, all of it was deliberate. She sat in her office late one evening, the city below darkened by rain that streaked the windows like tears the building couldn't quite cry. Thunder rumbled in the distance, the kind of storm that promised to cleanse without quite delivering. She reviewed a stream of reports on her tablet, each one detailing small frictions, minor obstacles, subtle resistances. Each one on its own meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern as clear as a signature. Elias stood nearby, jacket draped over a chair, sleeves rolled up in the way that meant he'd been working for hours and intended to work for hours more. His tie was loosened. His usual precision had given way to the focused exhaustion of someone managing multiple crises simultaneously. He's testing the perimeter, Elias said, reading over her shoulder at the latest report, a vendor suddenly demanding payment terms that violated their existing contract, seeing who hesitates, who flinches, who might be convinced to switch allegiance if the pressure continues. Who has? Amara asked, not looking up from the screen. Elias hesitated, which was answer enough. He pulled up a chair and sat down heavily, the kind of sitting that communicated worry. More than I'd like, he admitted. Less than he needs, maybe a dozen entities that have become unreliable, another 20 that are wavering. Out of 463 critical partners, vendors, and institutional relationships. Amara did the math, 5% showing cracks, not catastrophic but concerning, like finding termites. The visible damage suggested invisible structure degradation. She leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes briefly. Control was never absolute. It required constant reinforcement, constant awareness, constant cultivation. Her grandmother had understood that better than anyone. Victoria used to say that power was like a garden, beautiful if tended, overrun by weeds the moment you turned your back. Let him keep pushing, Amara said at last, opening her eyes, but start documenting everything, every contact he makes, every pressure point he applies, every conversation he has that attempts to undermine our relationships. For what purpose? For when subtlety fails, she replied, meeting his eyes. It always does with men like Marcus. Eventually they overreach. Eventually they do something undeniable. I want the full record when that happens. Elias studied her face, looking for signs of stress or fear or doubt. He found none, which seemed to both reassure and concern him. You're not afraid, he observed. No, she said, I'm disappointed. That surprised him. In what? That he mistook humiliation for strategy, she said softly, turning to look out at the rain-darkened city. Revenge isn't strength, it's insecurity. Real power doesn't need to wound others to exist. It just exists. Victoria understood that. She spent 40 years never publicly humiliating anyone, and she built something that outlasted everyone who underestimated her. Marcus doesn't understand that. No, he thinks power is about making people fear you. Actually, sustainable power is about making people trust you. Fear works short-term, trust works generationally. Outside, thunder rolled low across the sky, rattling the windows in their frames. Elias watched her silently for a moment, then said quietly, "The family is fracturing. Not along the lines Marcus wants, but fracturing nonetheless. People are choosing sides." "I know. Does that concern you?" Amara considered the question honestly. "Yes and no. It concerns me because fracturing weakens us all. It doesn't concern me because some fractures were inevitable. Some relationships were built on false assumptions about power distribution. Those needed to break anyway." "That's cold calculus." "It's realistic calculus," she corrected. "My grandmother built something extraordinary, but she built it partially on opacity. People made assumptions. Those assumptions created relationships that were never going to survive clarity. Better they break now cleanly than slowly poison everything." "Marcus is calling it a coup." Amara laughed, a short, sharp sound without much humor. "Of course he is, because he can't admit he never understood how power was actually distributed. Calling it a coup lets him be a victim, rather than someone who was simply wrong about fundamental realities." Elias stood, moving to the window to stand beside her. Together they watched the storm move across the city, lightning illuminating distant buildings in brief, stark clarity. "He'll escalate," Elias said quietly. "I know. He'll look for something dramatic, something that forces a crisis." "I know that too. And you're prepared." Amara turned to look at him directly. "Elias, I've been preparing for this since I was 23 years old. Since the first board meeting where men who worked for my grandmother spoke over me while she was dying in a hospital bed. Since the first family dinner where someone made a comment about decorative women. Since the first time someone assumed my silence meant I had nothing to say." She turned back to the window. "I'm not worried about Marcus escalating. I'm counting on it. Desperate people make mistakes, and Marcus is becoming very, very desperate." Part 7, Marcus's Gambit. Marcus Hale's opportunity arrived in the form of an emergency meeting 3 weeks after Amara's announcement. A regulatory inquiry, routine on paper, deeply unsettling in practice. The SEC had questions about certain trust transfers completed 18 months ago. The language was careful, bureaucratic, designed to be ambiguous. Were these transfers properly disclosed? Did they comply with securities regulations governing family holding companies? Had all beneficial owners been appropriately identified? Marcus hadn't orchestrated the inquiry entirely. He wasn't quite that connected, but he had nudged it. A suggestion here, carefully planted at a charity dinner with a deputy director he'd cultivated. A conversation there, casually mentioning unusual consolidation activity to a regulatory attorney at his firm. A forwarded article about governance transparency, sent to 3 different investigators with a note wondering if similar standards applied to family holdings. Enough to redirect attention without leaving fingerprints. He sat across from his legal team in his office, fingers steepled in the gesture he'd seen powerful men make in movies and adopted as his own signature pose. They were outlining potential exposure, speaking in the careful language attorneys used when the news wasn't good but wasn't catastrophic either. "If this becomes public," Jennifer Marks said cautiously. She was his lead outside counsel, a partner at a white shoe firm who specialized in regulatory defense. "Confidence could be shaken. Not destroyed, but shaken." "Not if we control the narrative," Marcus replied, voice carrying the certainty he no longer quite felt but knew he needed to project. "We frame it as a necessary review following a leadership transition. Standard procedure. Actually demonstrates good governance." "And if they find discrepancies?" asked Harmon, his inside counsel, a nervous man who always saw worst-case scenarios. "They won't," Marcus said with more confidence than the statement deserved, "because there aren't any. Victoria Vale was many things, but she wasn't sloppy with compliance. Everything she touched was legally airtight." "But Amara might not be as careful," Jennifer suggested, seeing where Marcus was heading. "Especially if she was consolidating authority quickly, quietly. Corners might have been cut." "Exactly," Marcus said, warming to the theory. "She's been operating in secret for years. Secret operations sometimes mean compliance shortcuts. The review puts her on defense, makes people question her judgment, her preparedness for public scrutiny." He imagined her calm composure cracking under regulatory pressure. Imagined the board questioning her methods, her transparency, her fitness for the visible leadership she'd claimed. Imagined the empire wobbling just enough to make people nostalgic for louder, more conventional leadership. Imagined, in short, getting back what he'd lost. That night, he slept better than he had in weeks. Part 8: The Inquiry. Amara did not sleep well. The inquiry notice arrived officially at 7 a.m. Delivered by special courier, as though the email notification wasn't enough to communicate seriousness. She read it twice standing in her kitchen, coffee growing cold in her hand, then once more seated at her desk with Elias on speakerphone. Her expression did not change, but something inside her tightened, not fear exactly, but recognition. The kind of tension that came from seeing an anticipated move finally made. "This isn't coincidence," Elias said unnecessarily, his voice carrying clearly through the speaker. "No," she agreed, "it's escalation." "You're prepared." It wasn't quite a question, but she answered anyway. "I'm prepared, but preparation doesn't eliminate damage, it only limits it." And there would be damage. Even a routine inquiry created headlines. Even baseless questions raised doubts. Even perfect compliance still meant months of distraction, legal fees, public scrutiny, and the thousand small ways regulatory attention eroded confidence. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to feel the weight of isolation. Power narrowed circles. Trust became precious and rare. The very consolidation that gave her control also made her uniquely vulnerable, because now everything flowed through her, every decision bore her signature, every choice became her sole responsibility. Victoria had carried this weight for 40 years. Amara was only now beginning to understand what that had cost. She spent that morning pulling files, reviewing every document related to the trust transfers, verifying every disclosure and filing and notification. The work Victoria had done was, as expected, immaculate. Every I dotted, every T crossed, every regulatory requirement not just met but exceeded. But Amara's own work, done more recently and more quickly, as she activated the consolidation mechanisms, that worried her. Not because she'd been careless, but because speed sometimes meant relying on existing structures without verifying every supporting document, because consolidating power across multiple jurisdictions meant navigating different regulatory frameworks simultaneously, because even perfect intent sometimes missed technical requirements. She found 3 potential issues: small things, disclosure forms filed 1 day late because of a jurisdictional question about which office had authority, a beneficial ownership statement that used an old corporate name instead of the updated one after a merger, a trust document that referenced a subsidiary by its former designation. Nothing material, nothing deceptive, nothing that changed any substantive reality. But enough to sustain an inquiry, enough to generate questions, enough to create the appearance of sloppiness that Marcus could weaponize. That evening, she stood alone in her penthouse as the sun set over New Jersey, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded her of bruises. The city below flickered to life, lights activating in sequence as though following some orchestrated plan, invisible to those within it. She thought of the dinner again, the laughter, the glances, the silence that had followed Marcus's words. Humiliation lingered longer than people admitted, not because it wounded pride, but because it revealed intention. It showed who people really were beneath the social performance. Marcus had revealed himself that night, and now he was revealing himself again, more completely, in ways he probably didn't fully recognize. A message came through on her phone. "Elias, he's moving faster than expected, and not carefully. I'm hearing he's personally contacted 3 different regulatory officials. That's unusual." Amara stared at the message, reading between the lines. Unusual meant trackable, meant potentially inappropriate, meant Marcus might be creating his own exposure while trying to create hers. She typed back, "Document everything, and I mean everything." "Elias, already am." She set the phone down and returned to watching the city, feeling something shift inside her. This was the darkest part, the stretch where resolve was tested not by defeat, but by erosion, where you couldn't see the end clearly, couldn't be certain the architecture you'd built would hold against the pressure being applied. This was where her grandmother's voice mattered most. The hardest part isn't building power, Victoria had told her once, near the end. It's keeping it when everyone wants to take it away, when people who never cared before suddenly care very much, when allies become questionable and enemies become creative. "How did you do it?" Amara had asked. "I remembered that their attacks said more about them than about me, and I waited for them to reveal themselves completely before responding." Amara breathed out slowly, watching her reflection ghost-like in the darkening window. Marcus was revealing himself. The inquiry was just one move, there would be others. He was operating from desperation now, which made him both dangerous and predictable. And if you've ever watched someone challenge your authority quietly, steadily, making you question your footing, you know how lonely that space can feel. How the uncertainty erodes confidence even when you're certain you're right. How the waiting becomes its own kind of test. Amara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it all, the empire, the responsibility, the isolation, the constant calculation. Then she opened them again and got back to work. Part 9. Separation. The separation came swiftly and from unexpected directions. Within days of the inquiry becoming public knowledge, because of course it became public knowledge, these things always did, the empire began fracturing along fault lines Amara hadn't fully anticipated. A scheduled joint appearance at a charity gala was cancelled. A planned strategy session postponed indefinitely. Allies began choosing sides without announcing it, their positions communicated through absences and silences rather than declarations. Even Elias, ever present, found himself pulled into parallel crises that demanded his attention elsewhere. A lawsuit filed against one of the subsidiaries, a partner threatening to exit a lucrative joint venture, a regulatory question in Singapore that needed immediate attention. None of these crises were coincidental. All of them had Marcus's fingerprints, though proving it would be impossible. For the first time in years, Amara felt truly alone at the center of something enormous. The inquiry intensified, media whispers grew louder, fed by anonymous sources who seemed remarkably well informed about internal family dynamics. Articles appeared questioning whether quiet leadership was adequate for modern markets, whether traditional governance could survive increased scrutiny, whether consolidation had been transparent or secretive. The words were carefully chosen to plant doubt, without making specific accusations. Then Marcus gave an interview. He never mentioned Amara by name, he was far too clever for that. But he spoke of unseasoned leadership and the risks of quiet authority in turbulent markets. He spoke of the importance of experience and the value of visible, confident decision-making. He spoke calmly, reasonably, like a man offering concern rather than challenge, wisdom rather than attack. In family enterprises, he said to Bloomberg, settling back in his chair with the ease of someone who believed every word he was saying, there's sometimes a tendency to prioritize lineage over capability, to confuse heritage with competence. I think we're seeing some of that dynamic play out now, and it concerns me. Not for personal reasons. I have enormous respect for everyone in our family, but for the health of an enterprise that employs thousands of people and serves countless stakeholders. The interviewer, sensing blood in the water, pressed, "Are you saying the current leadership is inadequate?" "I'm saying transparency matters, experience matters, the ability to withstand scrutiny matters." Marcus leaned forward, projecting earnest concern. When leadership operates in shadows, when power consolidates without explanation, when regulatory questions emerge about basic compliance, these are warning signs, and responsible family members have an obligation to speak up. It was masterful, really, never quite crossing the line into direct attack, never saying anything actionable, but creating an unmistakable narrative. Amara was inexperienced, secretive, possibly non-compliant, definitely not up to the task. Amara watched the clip once in her office, alone, late at night. Then she closed her laptop and sat in darkness, feeling something she hadn't felt since her grandmother's funeral. Despair. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind that crept in like carbon monoxide, invisible and insidious. The kind that whispered maybe they're right, maybe you've overreached, maybe quiet leadership isn't enough, maybe you should have stayed invisible. She sat with those thoughts. Not fighting them, not dismissing them, just sitting. Her grandmother had told her once that doubt was different from defeat. Doubt was information. Defeat was surrender to that information. Feel the doubt, Victoria had said. Examine it, see if it's telling you something true. If it is, adjust. If it isn't, dismiss it. But don't confuse the feeling with the reality. Amara took a breath and examined her doubt. Was she inexperienced? No, she had 12 years of strategic work, 6 years of active consolidation, 3 decades of watching and learning. Was she secretive? Not inherently. She had operated within established structures, using mechanisms that were documented and legal. Was she non-compliant? No, the inquiry would find nothing because there was nothing to find, just the minor technical discrepancies that existed in any complex structure. Was she inadequate? That was the real question, the one that hurt because it touched something deeper than facts. She thought about the dinner, about Marcus's casual cruelty, about her silence in response, about all the times she'd chosen restraint over assertion, patience over performance. Was that inadequate? Or was it exactly what sustainable power looked like? She didn't have an answer, not yet, the doubt remained. But she knew one thing: Marcus's interview was an overreach. In trying to seem reasonable, he'd revealed his desperation. In trying to avoid directly attacking her, he'd made his attack too obvious. People who understood power would see it. Those who didn't, well, she didn't need them anyway. She stood, turned on the lights, and returned to work. Part 10: The Turn. The turning point came from an unexpected place. A letter, handwritten on cream paper, slipped under her door by building security with no return address, no identifying marks, just her name on an envelope that looked like it belonged to another century. Inside was a single sheet, the ink neat and deliberate, the handwriting familiar though she couldn't immediately place it. You once asked me why your grandmother trusted you more than anyone else. I never answered because you weren't ready to understand. The truth is, she trusted your patience. She knew you would wait until people revealed themselves completely before acting. She knew you wouldn't waste energy on small victories when larger ones were available. The inquiry is not what it seems. Follow the secondary trusts, not the obvious ones that are under investigation, the ones established in 1987 and restructured in 2003. Look at who was required to be notified of those restructurings. Look at who actually was notified. Look at who failed to properly file their beneficial ownership statements. Marcus has been careless, not just recently, for years, and carelessness creates exposure. You have all the pieces, you just haven't looked at them as a whole. Amara stared at the page. Not Elias, he would have emailed, called, come in person. He didn't deal in mysterious letters. Who else had that initial? Who else knew enough to write these words? Who else had access to her building's security? Then it hit her, Elena. Her Aunt Elena, who had stiffened at the dinner, who had sent those anxious voicemails, who had watched Marcus's performance with what Amara had mistaken for passive discomfort. Elena, who had been Victoria's closest confidant before she died, who had helped structure some of the original trusts, who had been around long enough to see everything, remember everything, understand how all the pieces fit together. Elena, who had been waiting, like Amara, for the right moment. Amara moved quickly then, pulling files with new eyes, cross-referencing data Elias had once dismissed as settled history. Secondary trusts, dormant entities, old signatures from beneficial ownership statements filed decades ago. She found the 1987 trusts, 3 of them, established by Victoria during a period of expansion, found the 2003 restructuring that had been triggered by some long-forgotten regulatory change, found the list of required notifications, and found, buried in documents that should have been routine, that Marcus had been a beneficiary of one of those trusts, had been required to file ownership statements annually, had failed to do so for nearly a decade. The failure was technical, the kind of thing that happened when you inherited a position and didn't pay attention to administrative requirements, the kind of thing that most of the time didn't matter. Until it did. Until someone used regulatory pressure as a weapon, until someone tried to create scrutiny around compliance. Because the same SEC inquiry examining Amara's recent consolidation could easily expand to examine all trust-related filings, could easily discover that Marcus, while publicly questioning her compliance, had himself been non-compliant for years. The pattern emerged slowly, then all at once. Marcus had overreached catastrophically. In his haste to pressure her, he had invited scrutiny that would inevitably turn on his own failures. He had weaponized compliance review without ensuring his own compliance was beyond question. He had, in effect, loaded a gun and handed it to her. Amara felt something shift inside her, not relief exactly, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when pieces fall into place and reveal a picture you couldn't see before. She called Elias. "It's time," she said when he answered. Time for what? Time to respond, time to show him what real power looks like. What do you need? Everything we have on Marcus's compliance history, every trust distribution he's received, every filing he should have made, every technical requirement he's missed. I want it documented, verified, and ready to present. To the SEC. No, her voice was calm, certain. To him, privately, with an offer he'll understand. What kind of offer? The kind that ends this quietly. The the kind that lets him step back with whatever dignity he has left, the kind that makes clear what happens if he chooses to continue. Elias was quiet for a moment. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. He tried to use regulatory pressure as a weapon. I'm going to show him why that was a mistake." She could hear the smile in Elias' voice when he responded. "Your grandmother would have approved." "I know, that's how I know it's right." Part 11. The confrontation. The final confrontation did not happen in public. It happened in a closed boardroom on the 42nd floor of a building neither family member owned, late at night, with rain streaking the windows and tension thick enough to taste. Neutral ground chosen deliberately, a meeting room that could be reserved anonymously, where no security cameras would record what was said, where no assistants or attorneys or witnesses would complicate what needed to be simple. Marcus arrived first, naturally. Amara had arranged it that way, giving him the psychological advantage of choosing his seat, settling into the space, believing he controlled the environment. Let him have his small victories, they wouldn't matter. He sat at the head of the table, of course he did, in a charcoal suit that probably cost $5,000, every hair in place, cufflinks gleaming. His expression was carefully arranged into something between concerned and confident, the face of a reasonable man prepared to have a difficult conversation about family responsibilities. Amara entered without ceremony 15 minutes later. She carried a single leather portfolio, wore the same navy suit she'd worn for the press conference, the pearls always the pearls, her hair pulled back simply, no armor, no costume, no performance. Just clarity. She took the seat to his right, a choice that unsettled him slightly, she could see, not across from him where confrontation would be expected, beside him as though they were on the same side of something. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, settling into the chair with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove. Marcus nodded, studying her face for weakness. "Your message said it was urgent." "It is." She opened the portfolio, removing a thin stack of documents, set them on the table between them, not pushing them toward him, just making them present. He glanced at them but didn't reach for them. "What are these?" "Proof," Amara said simply, "of compliance failures spanning nearly 10 years, beneficial ownership statements not filed, distribution notifications not completed, annual trust reports submitted late or not at all." Marcus's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "I'm sure my attorneys." "These aren't about your attorneys," Amara interrupted gently. "These are about you, personally, as a beneficiary of 3 family trusts established in 1987 and restructured in 2003. You inherited those positions when your father died in 2012, and you failed to properly maintain the compliance requirements that came with them." Now she pushed the documents toward him. "I've verified everything, cross-referenced it with SEC filings, state trust documents, internal family records. You're non-compliant, Marcus, significantly and demonstrably non-compliant." He picked up the first document, reading it with the careful attention of someone looking for an escape route. His jaw tightened as he recognized what he was seeing. "This is technical," he said finally. "Administrative, the kind of thing that happens in complex structures." "Yes," Amara agreed. "Exactly the kind of technical, administrative thing that can sustain a regulatory inquiry. The kind of thing that looks very bad when someone has been publicly questioning other people's compliance." Marcus set the document down. "Are you threatening me?" "No," her voice remained calm, factual. "I'm showing you reality. You invited regulatory scrutiny. That scrutiny can flow in multiple directions. Currently, it's focused on me, on consolidation activities that will ultimately prove completely compliant. But attention is attention, and attention has a way of finding what's actually there to find." She let that sit for a moment. "The question," she continued, "is what happens next. We can continue the way we've been going, you applying pressure, me defending against it, both of us creating chaos that damages the family and the enterprise, or we can end this, quietly, definitively." Marcus leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking slightly. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm proposing you step back, fully. You retain your ownership stake, your distributions, your seat on the family council, but you stop trying to exercise operational influence. You stop talking to reporters. You stop making calls to regulators or partners or anyone else designed to undermine confidence in current leadership." "And if I don't?" Amara met his eyes directly. "Then I share these documents with the same SEC investigators you've been speaking with. I make sure they understand the full scope of compliance issues within the family structure. and I let them discover what they discover. That would damage you too. Probably, she acknowledged, but I can survive it. My compliance is solid. Yours isn't. We both know how that ends. Marcus studied her face, looking for bluff, for weakness, for any indication this was negotiable. He found none. You'd burn it all down, he asked quietly. To protect what my grandmother built from someone trying to take it through malice and manipulation. Yes, without hesitation. She paused, but I'd rather not. I'd rather you make the choice that lets everyone preserve dignity. The silence stretched between them, filled only by rain against glass and the hum of the building's ventilation system. Finally Marcus spoke. I misjudged you. Yes, Amara said simply, no gloating, no triumph, just fact. I thought control had to be visible, he continued, more to himself than to her. I thought if people didn't fear you, they wouldn't follow you. And now I see they followed you before they ever feared you. They followed because you protected things, because you maintained stability, because you did the work no one noticed while people like me performed authority we didn't actually have. It was, Amara realized, the first genuine thing he'd said to her in years, probably the first genuine thing he'd said to himself. I won't interfere, Marcus said finally, his voice carrying resignation but also relief, the relief of someone who'd been carrying a weight they could finally set down. That's my assurance. I didn't need it, Amara replied honestly, but I'll accept it. They sat for a moment longer, two people who would never be allies but might possibly achieve something like peace. Can I ask you something? Marcus said. Yes. That dinner when I said those things, he seemed to be searching for words. You knew then, didn't you? You knew you could end me whenever you wanted. Amara considered how to answer, settled on truth. I knew I had power, she said. I didn't know if I'd need to use it. You made that choice, not me. By humiliating you. By revealing who you were, the humiliation was yours to own, not mine to carry. Marcus absorbed that, nodded slowly. He stood, preparing to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, he said, your grandmother would have been proud, not of destroying me, though she probably would have approved of that too, but of how you did it, quietly, completely, with the minimum force necessary. He walked to the door, then turned back one final time. I'm sorry, he said, for the dinner, for everything after. I was trying to be something I'm not. Amara inclined her head, acknowledging without absolving. The door closed behind him with a soft click. She sat alone in the conference room for several minutes, feeling the weight lift, feeling the tension uncoil, feeling something close to completion settle into her bones. Then she gathered the documents, returned them to her portfolio, and walked out into the night. Behind her, the rain continued falling, washing the city clean. Part 12, Time and Transformation. Time did what time always did. It softened edges, it provided perspective, it transformed crisis into history, urgency into anecdote. A year passed. The SEC inquiry concluded with no findings. The technical discrepancies Amara had worried about were noted and corrected, deemed immaterial by investigators who had larger concerns than family trusts with minor filing delays. Marcus's compliance issues were quietly remediated with the help of attorneys who specialized in precisely this kind of historical cleanup. No charges filed, no public disclosure, just correction and closure. He kept his word, attended family dinners when required, voted his shares according to stated positions, spoke publicly only in generalities about market conditions that had nothing to do with family business. He had become, essentially, what Amara had always been, present but not prominent, powerful but not performative. The irony was not lost on either of them. The family empire expanded carefully, sustainably. Amara's leadership, now fully visible, fully accepted, brought stability that allowed for strategic growth. She delegated more, trusting systems she had built to hold without constant oversight. Meetings became more efficient, decisions clearer, the performance aspect of leadership, the showing off, the posturing, the constant proving, diminished. People focused on work instead of politics. Respect, she learned, did not need to be demanded once it was earned. Elia's became something else entirely. It happened gradually, the way significant changes often do, so slowly you don't notice the transformation until you're already standing in something new. Their professional relationship had always been close. Trust built over years of working in tandem, of finishing each other's strategic thoughts, of understanding without explaining. But somewhere in the crucible of those months, the inquiry, the pressure, the isolation, that professional closeness had evolved into something more personal. It started with longer conversations after the work was done, dinners that weren't about business, walks through the city at night when both of them should have been sleeping, but neither could quite settle into rest. Started with Elias showing her parts of himself he'd kept carefully separated from his professional persona, the paintings he collected, the poetry he read, the vulnerability he rarely showed. Started with Amara realizing that the person she trusted most with her empire was also the person she wanted to trust with everything else. Their relationship unfolded quietly, deliberately. No announcement, no spectacle. They simply became a they in the natural way that happened when two people who already knew each other well discovered they wanted to know each other better. Those who noticed, noticed. Those who didn't matter. One evening in late spring, as cherry blossoms transformed the park into something from a different century, they walked together without destination or agenda. "I've been thinking," Elias said, his hand finding hers with the comfortable familiarity of ritual. "That's dangerous," Amara replied lightly, smiling. He smiled back, then grew serious. "You've built something rare, something resilient, but legacies don't survive on structure alone." "I know. They survive on succession," he said, "on teaching people not just what you did, but why, on making sure the next generation understands that power is architecture, not performance." Amara looked out over the blooming trees, considering. She had been thinking about this too, about what came after, about how to pass on not just ownership but philosophy. "Then I suppose it's time I stopped being invisible to the right people," she said. "Time to teach what I've learned. Time to make sure this outlasts me the way it outlasted Victoria." "You're 38, Elias said with gentle humor, thinking about legacy already." "Victoria was 40 when she started teaching me," Amara replied. "She said the best time to think about succession is before you need to. That way it's about building rather than scrambling." They walked in comfortable silence for a while, hands linked, thinking about futures that were both immediate and distant. Part 13, Full Circle. The final dinner was nothing like the first. Same table, same room, same city glowing beyond the windows. Completely different energy. Amara arrived neither early nor late, but precisely on time. She wore burgundy this time, a departure from her usual neutrals, a choice that felt less like strategy and more like simple preference. The pearls, though, always the pearls. The room filled easily with conversation that flowed rather than performed. Elena sat near Amara, the alliance they'd formed now open rather than secret. Daniel had found confidence in the stability, contributing thoughtfully rather than anxiously. The younger cousins, Rebecca and two others who joined the family business, asked questions with genuine curiosity rather than performative interest. Even Marcus attended. He sat midway down the table, neither prominent nor hidden. When he spoke, people listened without tension. When he laughed, it sounded almost genuine. He had found something like peace in his diminished role, or at least acceptance, which was close enough. No one spoke over anyone else. No one performed authority. They shared food that tasted like food rather than strategy, stories shaped by familiarity rather than competition, laughter that came from actual humor rather than social obligation. Amara watched it all with quiet satisfaction. This was what power was for, not dominance, not control for its own sake, stewardship, the cultivation of something that could outlast any individual person. At one point, Rebecca, now 28 and showing promise as a strategic thinker, asked Amara directly, "How did you know when to reveal yourself, when to stop being invisible?" The table quieted, everyone suddenly interested in the answer. Amara considered the question carefully, looked around the table at faces she knew intimately, histories she carried, futures she was helping shape. "I didn't know," she said honestly. "I just knew when not to. I knew that power revealed prematurely is power diminished, that clarity offered before people are ready to see it gets dismissed or resented, so I waited until someone forced the question." She didn't look at Marcus, didn't need to. Everyone knew who she meant. "And then," Rebecca pressed. "And then I answered it, completely, definitively, once." "Does it get easier?" another cousin asked. "The responsibility, the isolation?" Amara smiled slightly. "No, but you get better at carrying it. You learn that isolation isn't the same as loneliness, that you can be alone in authority while surrounded by people you trust, that power doesn't require distance, it just requires clarity about where the lines are. Elena caught her eye across the table, smiled with understanding that spanned decades. As the evening wound down, coffee served, desserts distributed, conversations fragmenting into smaller exchanges, Amara found herself standing at the window overlooking the city. Elias joined her there, 2 glasses of port in hand. He offered one without speaking. They stood side by side, watching lights flicker and flow in patterns that suggested order while hiding chaos. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "Miss what?" "Being underestimated, the invisibility." Amara thought about that honestly. There had been freedom in being overlooked, safety in having people dismiss you, the ability to observe without being observed, to learn without being judged, to make mistakes privately rather than publicly. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but less than I thought I would. Turns out being seen clearly, actually seen, not just watched, is worth the loss of protective obscurity." Even with the scrutiny, the pressure, the constant awareness that everyone's watching. Even with all that, she sipped the port, letting the sweetness linger, because being invisible was its own kind of pressure, its own performance, having to constantly calibrate how much to show, how much to hide, who to trust with which pieces of truth. "And now I just have to be competent," she said, "which is actually easier than pretending to be less competent than I am." Elias laughed softly. "Victoria would have loved hearing you say that." "She lived it," Amara replied. "For 40 years, I'm just following the path she cleared." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the city that had witnessed everything, the humiliation, the revelation, the transformation. Behind them, the family continued their dinner, voices rising and falling in the natural rhythm of people who no longer had to perform kinship, but could simply experience it. Amara turned back to look at them, this collection of people bound by blood and money and history, and felt something settle deep in her chest. Not triumph, not vindication, something quieter and more enduring. Purpose. She had protected what Victoria built, had expanded it carefully, had ensured it would survive not just her grandmother's death but her own eventual departure, had created structures that would outlast personalities, systems that would persist beyond individuals. She had done what needed doing, quietly, completely, without spectacle. And now she could focus on what came next, the teaching, the building, the slow cultivation of succession that would ensure this endured for another generation. "Ready to go back?" Elias asked. Amara took a final look at the city, then turned toward the table where her family sat. "Yes," she said, "I think I am." Epilogue: The Architecture of Silence. 5 years later, Amara stood in the same library where Elias had toasted restraint, where her grandmother's books lined shelves in careful order, where generations of accumulated wisdom waited to be discovered by those patient enough to look. She was preparing for a different kind of meeting now, not a confrontation, not a revelation, a teaching session. Rebecca sat in one of the leather chairs, a folder open on her lap, questions forming behind eyes that reminded Amara of herself at that age, watchful, curious, strategic. "I don't understand," Rebecca said, reviewing documents Amara had just explained. "If you've controlled 95% for years, why maintain the other structures? Why not just consolidate everything under one entity?" Amara smiled. It was the right question, the kind that showed Rebecca was thinking structurally rather than just mechanically. "Because power that looks total is power that invites total challenge," Amara explained, settling into the chair opposite. "Distributed structures create the impression of shared control even when effective authority is consolidated. People challenge what they think they can change. When they can't quite see the full picture, they're less likely to try." "So it's deception?" "No, it's architecture. Every piece is real, every structure functions. The distribution isn't false, it's just that the voting mechanisms mean effective control flows to one point while nominal control remains dispersed." Rebecca processed that, made notes in careful handwriting that reminded Amara of another time, another student learning these lessons. "Victoria taught you this," Rebecca said, not a question. "Yes, over years, the same way I'm teaching you now." "Because you're preparing me." Amara nodded. "Because sustainable power requires succession. Because teaching someone takes longer than most people think. Because by the time you realize you need a successor, it's usually too late to properly train one. How long did Victoria teach you? 12 years, from the time I was 23 until she died, and even that wasn't enough. I learned as much in the 3 years after her death as I did in the 12 before it. Rebecca looked up from her notes, eyes serious. Was it worth it? The isolation, the restraint, the years of people underestimating you? Amara considered the question with the honesty it deserved. Yes, she said finally, because the alternative was performing power I hadn't earned, claiming authority I didn't yet understand, making mistakes that would have damaged not just me, but everyone depending on the structures Victoria built. She paused, then added, and because restraint isn't the same as suffering, patience isn't deprivation, I was learning the whole time, watching, building. The visibility came when I was ready for it, not before, not after, exactly when. And when will I be ready? Amara smiled. When you stop asking that question, when you know without needing confirmation. When you understand that readiness isn't a state someone grants you, but a recognition you grant yourself. Rebecca absorbed that, nodding slowly. Outside, the city continued its eternal motion, deals closing, fortunes shifting, empires rising and falling in the endless cycle that characterized human ambition. But here, in this quiet room filled with accumulated wisdom, a different kind of power was being transferred, not through spectacle or ceremony, but through teaching and time and the patient cultivation of understanding. Amara watched Rebecca process these lessons, seeing herself reflected in the younger woman's careful attention, her strategic questions, her growing recognition that power was architecture rather than performance. And she remembered sitting in this exact chair years ago, listening to Victoria explain these same principles, feeling overwhelmed and underprepared, and absolutely certain she would never be ready. But she had been ready. When the moment came, she had been ready. Because Victoria had taught her not just what to do, but why, not just how power worked, but how it endured, not just the mechanics of control, but the philosophy behind it. And now Amara was doing the same for Rebecca. The cycle continued, the architecture held, the silence, that powerful, protective silence that had allowed her to observe, to learn, to build without announcing herself prematurely, had proven its worth. She stood, moving to the window, looking out at the same city that had witnessed her rise without spectacle, her victory without violence, her authority without announcement. Behind her, Rebecca continued studying the documents, asking occasional questions, learning the architecture of power one stone at a time. And Amara understood, finally and completely, what her grandmother had meant all those years ago. Leadership is not about making people respect you. It's about making them realize they should have respected you all along. If you followed this story to its end, through humiliation and revelation, through patience and power, through the quiet architecture of sustainable authority, take a moment to reflect. How many times in your own life has silence been mistaken for weakness? How many times have you waited, not because you couldn't act, but because timing mattered more than pride? The world celebrates the loud victories, the dramatic confrontations, the spectacle of power claimed through force or performance, but some of the most enduring victories happen in whispers, in patience, in the discipline to build architecture rather than perform authority.